When the final wave of earthquake struck the island, the devastated land could no longer withstand the onslaught. The once majestic palaces, symbols of wealth and power, began to crumble. The ground split beneath the people's feet, forming deep fissures through which water and lava poured into the island's depths. It was as if the earth itself was exhaling for the last time, spewing out clouds of ash and smoke. Soon, entire sections of the continent began to sink. Atlantis, once the mightiest kingdom on earth, vanished into the sea like a ship swallowed by a storm. The last of its great buildings and monuments disappeared beneath the water, swept away by relentless currents. The crash of collapsing structures and the cries of the doomed mingled with the roar of the sea. Thunder rolled across the sky, echoing like the final toll of a dying world. Realizing the inevitability of their fate, people prayed to both old and new gods and whispered their last goodbyes to the loved ones. Their voices, pleas, wails, and desperate prayers were soon drowned out by the incessant roar of the sea. Massive torrents of water swallowed roads and bridges, fields and forests. The ocean, once a giver of life and prosperity, had turned into a merciless destroyer. Everything that had once embodied grandeur, beauty, and power was reduced to rubble and swept away by the maelstrom. The final moments were marked by an apocalyptic disaster as the sky and sea converged in a final, catastrophic clash. Panic reigned on the decks of the ships. People, many holding small children in their arms, were overcome with unspeakable terror. These ships were their last hope of salvation, the only fragile links to a past they were leaving behind forever. From the railings, they watched in horror as those who did not make it to safety perished. Parents covered their children's ears to shield them from the last desperate cries of those swallowed by the merciless waves. It was a cataclysm of planetary proportions. Poseidon stood majestically on the Temple Mount, his trident gleaming as it sliced through the darkness. The ocean rose higher and higher, eager to claim the last hero of Atlantis in its mighty embrace. The great spirit's gaze radiated determination and compassion. His powerful body swayed to the rhythm of the elements. Poseidon knew his time had finally come. However, there was one last act he needed to perform, saving those aboard the ships. Those who still clung to hope and believed in a miracle. He had to protect his loyal friends, his disciples, and the surviving people of Atlantis, who were destined not to conquer and subjugate, but to spread the light of true faith and wisdom across the ocean to distant lands. He was prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice. The Great Spirit raised his trident high, radiating a brilliant light, much like the torch in Yeshua's hands. Poseidon wielded his sacred weapon with rhythmic, commanding movements, bending the fury of the sea to his will. Deep as the ocean itself, his resounding voice carried over the departing ships, defying even the howling winds.
I, Poseidon, solar son, give my life for the salvation of the last of the Atlanteans. Father, into your hands I surrender my spirit.
With each sweeping motion of the trident, the ocean became more obedient. Where the doomed ships had struggled against the raging waters, a colossal vortex began to form, drawing the turbulent currents down into its depths. A safe passageway emerged, providing a corridor for the fleeing ships. For Stefano, the sight was like a vision from sacred history. The staff of Moses parting the sea. The divine essence of Poseidon gave way to his human nature, and with each sweep of his trident, his strength waned as he poured out his love and life for the sake of humanity. He had walked the earth many times and would return once again to guide humanity on its path of spiritual evolution. As the last ship sailed away from the ocean-swallowed Atlantis, Poseidon exhaled one final mighty breath. He transformed again into Orpheus, and his trident became a lyre as the master sang his last hymn to the lost Atlantis. As the waves claimed him, the raging storm subsided, leaving behind a few scattered islands that were once the towering peaks of a vanished world. Atlantis has dissolved, engulfed by the ocean, leaving only myths that would be passed down through generations for thousands of years. The jest of Orpheus gave rise to the legend of the sea god Poseidon. The ships, bathed in soft moonlight, drifted into the unknown, carrying the memory of the flood and the heroism of the solar sun, whose sacrifice had become another link between ruin and rebirth. In the darkness of the night, an uneasy silence settled over the decks. The people stood in quiet reverence, shaken by the loss of their homeland. They knew a long and arduous journey lay ahead, but a spark of hope still burned in their hearts. The memory of the God who had given his life for their salvation. The sea wind dried the tears from Queen Isis' face. She held little Princess Athena and the young princess close, cradling them tenderly. The children who had not yet fully tasted the joys and sorrows of life were now forced to witness a catastrophe that shattered their innocent dreams. With a heavy heart, Isis remembered how deeply they had adored Orpheus and how the master had always said that his happiest moments were spent with children. He often repeated that all who followed his teachings must become like little children to attain true spiritual wisdom. He who welcomes a child, the prophet had said, welcomes the Son of Man. Once, they watched Orpheus angrily chase out the priests and followers of the Demiurge's new religion from the temple when they attempted to erect a statue of Atlantis' new patron saint. On that day, he told the children that this temple would soon be destroyed, but that they, Horus, Rama, Dionysus, and Noah, the young rulers of Atlantis, were destined to establish new civilizations that would continue humanity's incredible journey toward God. Sitting on Orpheus' lap, Princess Athena listened with wide-eyed wonder to his tales of future worlds, envisioning that one day, she too would become a great and just ruler who cared for her people. Tears welled up in Isis's eyes again, but she knew that she would see Orpheus again when the time came. The queen also knew that her children and little Melchizedek would one day fulfill the master's prophecy and change the world. Standing on the deck of the royal flagship, King Osiris watched as the great continent sank beneath the waves. His heart ached for all who had perished, regardless of their faith or allegiance. The majestic robes of the last king of Atlantis, once gleaming with gold and purple, had darkened with grief and sorrow. The wind ruffled his hair, giving him the appearance of a lonely fallen titan. Osiris mourned his lost friend and teacher, the great initiate Orpheus, who had proven himself to be the son of God by sacrificing his life to save the last of the Atlanteans. However, the king understood that death held no power over Orpheus and that his great spirit would once again rise to guide humanity on its path to reunion with the Creator. Horus, the eldest of the princes, stood beside his father. His eyes were filled beside his father. His eyes were filled with unease. He understood their future was uncertain and their hopes for a new home fragile.
We are leaving behind everything we cherish, he whispered.
Little Melchizedek looked up at him and gripped his savior's hand tighter, unwilling to let go for even a moment.
Forward, into the unknown, Osiris replied. We must find a new way, a new life. We must believe that we will see the light again one day, as our master and lord foretold.
The ships of the last Atlanteans continued to glide over the dark waters, shrouded in silence and the soft veil of starlight and moon. Stefano was in deep shock and unable to move throughout the catastrophe. In fact, from the beginning of recorded history, he and those present in Gamaliel's house were the only witnesses to Atlantis' existence and destruction. Thea, eyes wide open, kept her gaze fixed on the endless expanse of the ocean. Despite her father's presence, she clung tightly to Stefano, which was a serious offense in ancient Judea. However, Gamaliel knelt and prayed in silence, moving only his lips, unaware of anyone around him. His silver hair was bowed, and his strong hands were clasped around his face. Not far from him sat Nicodemus, his chest bare. In a fit of religious ecstasy, the Pharisee had torn his outer garments to shreds. Stefano turned his gaze to Yeshua's disciples. Shimon, Andreas, Jacob, and Johanan stood side by side, their heads bowed and arms crossed over their chests. They had witnessed the transfiguration of Christ and many miracles, but this night of mystical fulfillment, revelation, and knowledge was particularly special to them. The apostles stood in silent obedience, awaiting their teacher's return and guidance. Saul and Levi stood apart from the others, lost in deep contemplation. Stefano looked around, but Miriam Magdalene was gone. Yet he knew where she was. At that very moment, she, the incarnate Queen Isis, along with her husband, children, and the last survivors of Atlantis, was sailing the vast waters of the Atlantic Ocean.